The thing David Hargrove still brings up isn't the number, and it isn't even the word the kid used when he said it couldn't be fixed. It's the laptop. Because when you're 63 and you've been running the same 400 acres in central Indiana since you were 19, you get a certain feel for what matters and what's just performance. The kid rolled in on a $68,000 diesel pickup with an embroidered dealership logo, and before he even looked at the tractor, before he even asked the right questions, he had that laptop open on the tailgate like the answer was already sitting there waiting to be found. Not plugged into anything. Not doing anything magical. Just a parts database and a search bar. David noticed that detail the way you notice a man setting his boots on your kitchen table. It doesn't have to be loud to be disrespectful. David's Oliver 1800 was parked by the barn door like it always was when something didn't feel right, and the problem had been building for 3 weeks in a way David couldn't ignore anymore. At first it was just a little grind in third gear, soft, intermittent, easy to excuse the way you excuse a sore knee. By the second week, it was there every time. By the third week, it wasn't just grinding. It was slipping when he tried to bring it up through the gears under load, and that's the kind of symptom that doesn't stay a symptom. It becomes a decision you have to make. He'd waited as long as he could, hoping it would be a linkage adjustment or a tired clutch or anything that could be handled in an hour. But the Oliver had started making that sound that says, in plain language, I'm about to quit on you at the worst possible moment. So he called the dealership in town, not because he wanted a kid with a laptop on his property, but because he wanted to know what the system would say. He wanted to know what a modern shop would do with an old machine that refused to die on schedule. The kid showed up the following Tuesday. Young. Polite. That polished kind of polite you get when somebody's been trained to be pleasant for a living. He asked David to start it. David did. He watched the kid climb up, settle in, and drive it like it was someone else's problem, which, to be fair, it was. The kid ran it through the gears once, twice, listened for maybe 40 seconds, and you could tell he heard it. Third gear told on itself quickly. The kid eased it back to a stop, shut it down, hopped off, wiped his hands on a shop rag he'd brought with him, and then, like the next step was always the next step, he turned around and opened the laptop. David stood there and didn't say anything. He didn't want to influence the moment. He wanted to see it happen clean. The kid typed the model number. Scrolled. Typed something else. Scrolled again. His face didn't change much, but his eyes started doing that searching thing where you can tell a person is trying to locate a path forward inside a system that only offers the paths it already knows. Then the kid looked up at David and said, Shift fork assembly. You can hear it in the engagement. Synchronizers might be warning too. He said it calmly, like he was reading a weather report, and then he added the part that had David's jaw tighten without him meaning to. These parts haven't been manufactured in decades. I've checked 3 supplier databases. No reman units, no new old stock. Nothing. He rotated the screen toward David and started pointing at lines of text as if the tractor would accept a verdict if it was backed by enough discontinued listings. Discontinued. No longer available. Superseded. No replacement. Page after page of dead ends. And then the kid said the phrase shops use when they want to close a door without sounding like they're closing it. In our system, when there's no viable parts path, we flag it as non-serviceable. That's where this lands. Non serviceable. David let the words sit for a second because he wanted to be sure he'd heard them. He looked at the laptop screen. He looked at the kid's clean hands. He looked at his Oliver sitting there like it had been listening to the whole conversation and had an opinion about it. He didn't argue. That's important. A lot of people imagine a man like David throwing a fit, but that's not how it went. He'd been alive long enough to know when a person is inside a script and isn't going to step out of it. He also knew something else. If you start arguing with a system, the system wins by exhausting you. So he just said, okay. Leave it. The kid blinked, maybe surprised David wasn't asking him to do something. Then he nodded and kept talking anyway, because that's what people do when they need to justify a conclusion. My honest recommendation, the kid said, it might be time to retire this one. Retire it. He said it like he was offering mercy. Like he was doing David a favor by telling him to let go. David didn't respond right away. Not because he didn't have words, but because he was busy doing the math a farmer does that a dealership doesn't understand. That tractor wasn't his primary machine. He had a 2011 Case IH Maxim 125 for the real work. The Oliver was older, smaller, and on paper, replaceable. But on a farm, replaceable is a word people use when they've never had to make the replacement happen. The Oliver was the tractor David used for the jobs that show up suddenly and punish you if you ignore them, moving hay bales in tight places near the creek bottom, pulling the old grain wagon through the barn lot, running the PTO on a vintage hay tedder he'd kept alive long past its warranty, long past its expected lifespan, long past the years anyone had planned for. It wasn't about horsepower. It was about fit. David knew that tractor the way you know a pocket knife you've carried for 20 years. Not because it's the only knife in the world, but because it's the knife you can open with your eyes closed and not cut yourself. So when the kid said retire it, what David heard wasn't a suggestion. What he heard was, you don't get to decide what stays alive. The database decides. That's why the laptop mattered. It wasn't the tool. It was what the tool implied, that the tractor's life could be reduced to whatever the search results permitted. The kid printed the estimate anyway, $4, $200 on yellow carbon paper, because that's how the process stays official. David took it without looking like it hurt, and he paid the $85 diagnostic fee because he wasn't going to give the dealership the satisfaction of saying he stiffed them. He watched that embroidered pickup back down his gravel lane and disappear. Then he stood in his yard with the paper in his hand and felt something he hadn't expected to feel over a tractor. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't even anger. It was insult. Not because the kid was rude. The kid had been polite. The insult was the assumption underneath the politeness, that if the system couldn't source a part, the machine was dead, and if the machine was dead, the story was over. David walked into the barn office and set the estimate on the desk like it was a dare. He didn't call his wife. There wasn't a wife to call, not anymore. The Oliver had outlasted one marriage, and David didn't need to tell the story of how that happened for it to be true. He just stood there for a moment, breathing, and then he picked up the phone and dialed Hank Dillard. Hank was 68. He lived 12 miles east. He'd sold his own operation in 2009 when his knees finally stopped negotiating with him, and now he showed up at David's place 3 or 4 mornings a week for the same reason a lot of men do when they stop farming full-time, because you don't retire from knowing how to do things, and you don't retire from needing to feel useful. Hank answered on the third ring. Yeah, he said, not hello, just yeah. David didn't waste words. Oliver's slipping in third, he said. Dealership says it's non-serviceable. Says parts are dead. Quotes 4,200. There was a pause, the kind of pause that isn't confusion, it's judgment. Then Hank said, they drove it. They drove it, David said. Then they opened a laptop. Hank made a sound that could have been a laugh if it had any joy in it. What did they find? Shift fork, David said. Maybe synchronizers. Another pause. Then Hank asked the only question that mattered. You want to fix it? David stared at the Oliver through the barn opening like the tractor might answer first. I want to know if it can be fixed, he said. Hank didn't say yes. Hank didn't say no. He said, I'll be there in the morning. How early? David asked. Early enough that you don't have time to talk yourself out of it, Hank said, and hung up. That night David didn't sleep the way he usually slept. His mind kept going back to the kid's screen full of discontinued listings. It kept going back to the word retire, said gently like a blessing. David had been around machines long enough to know some things do reach an end. Bearings wear. Metal fatigues. Cast iron cracks in February cold if you push it wrong. He wasn't romantic about it. But he also knew there was a difference between a machine that couldn't be repaired and a machine that couldn't be repaired by someone who needed the correct part number to exist before they could think. The Oliver 1800 had been introduced in 1960. By 1964 the line was already changing. By 1965 the designation was essentially retired. David didn't learn that from a brochure. He learned it the way farmers learn history, by keeping something running long enough that the manufacturer's timeline becomes irrelevant. That tractor had been on his farm since 1971, when his father bought it used for $3,400 from a neighbor 2 counties over. David had been 9, and he remembered sitting on the fender as they drove it home down Route 236, his hands cold against the metal, watching the fields go dark. He remembered that because the body remembers first ownership the way it remembers first grief. Over the decades the Oliver logged something north of 12,000 hours. It outlasted 2 combines, for trucks, and the parts counter that had once stocked what it needed. David replaced the clutch twice. Rebuilt the carburetor 3 times. Once in 1998 he'd fabricated a hydraulic line fitting from copper tubing and pliers because the part wasn't available and he needed the tractor in the ground by Thursday. That wasn't a heroic story to him. It was Tuesday. That was the difference between David and the kid with the laptop. The kid thought scarcity ended the conversation. David thought scarcity was when the conversation started. Around midnight David got up, went to the kitchen, and poured water he didn't drink. He stood there holding the glass and thinking about what $4,200 really meant. It wasn't just money. It was permission. It was the system saying, pay this, and we'll let you stay independent for another year. Pay this, and we'll pretend you didn't need the knowledge you don't have anymore. And David hated how much the offer sounded like something he was supposed to accept gratefully. In the dark of his kitchen, he decided something. If Hank showed up and said it was done, David would listen. He wasn't going to break the tractor trying to prove a point. But if Hank showed up and said there was a path, David wasn't going to let a search result close his barn door. At 6:15 the next morning Hank's truck came up the lane. Hank climbed out with a thermos under one arm and a canvas tool roll under the other, like he'd been doing it his whole life, because he had. He didn't walk in smiling. He didn't walk in with speeches. He walked in and looked straight at the Oliver and said, "Start it." David started it. Hank climbed up. He ran it through the gears once. When he hit third, his head tilted slightly, like a man listening to someone whisper a secret. He drove it back, shut it down, and stepped off. "Okay," Hank said. "Get the jack." David felt his chest loosen by half an inch. Hank didn't say non-serviceable. He didn't say retire. He didn't say 4200. He just moved. They drained the transmission fluid into a pan. Hank dipped 2 fingers in it, rubbed the oil between thumb and forefinger, and held it up. There were metal flecks in the dark fluid, and Hank nodded slowly like that was confirmation, not catastrophe. "She's been talking," Hank said. "We should have listened sooner," David replied. Hank didn't argue. "We're listening now," he said. They rolled the floor jack into place, set timbers, and started the kind of work that forces 2 men to communicate without saying much. Unbolt. Brace. Mark. Lift. Slide. The transmission didn't come out politely. It came out like anything heavy comes out when it's been sitting in place for decades, reluctantly, with a few sharp moments that make you stop and reassess your hands. By late morning, they had it separated. By early afternoon, the case was open on David's workbench. Hank leaned in and looked at the internals the way a doctor looks at an X-ray, not dramatic, just focused. Then he pointed. "There," he said, and David saw it. The third gear shift fork, cracked along the mounting boss. Not snapped clean. A stress fracture that had been flexing under load, letting the fork move just enough to cause that slipping. The synchronizer ring was worn too, but not dead. Hank spun it, pressed it, checked the seating surface, and made a decision. "Ring's workable," he said. "Fork's the problem." David stared at the cracked fork and felt a weird kind of relief. A broken thing is at least honest. "Can we get one?" David asked, already knowing the answer because he'd seen the laptop screen. Hank's face didn't change. "We'll see," he said, and that's where part 1 ends, because the next thing Hank does is pick up the phone, start calling places the laptop doesn't even know exist, and when that fails, he reaches for a hammer in a way that would make a certified transmission engineer lose their mind. Hank didn't say no parts like it was a tragedy, and he didn't say we're stuck like he was asking permission to quit. He just wiped his fingers on a rag, pulled his phone out, and started dialing numbers David hadn't called in years, the kind of numbers that used to live on the inside cover of a notebook because they were more reliable than any directory, and as he listened to the ringtones, David realized something that the kid's laptop never had a chance to reveal. The database wasn't the only map, it was just the map the dealership was allowed to use. Hank called a dealer 2 counties over first, asked for parts, gave the model, waited, listened, nodded once like he expected what was coming, then said all right and hung up. He called another place that used to rebuild old drivetrains back when people rebuilt things as a default, not as a hobby, and this time he spoke less, just "Oliver 1800 third gear fork, then you sure, then okay." He called a guy who ran a salvage yard and answered the phone like he'd been interrupted by work, not by a customer, and Hank asked if there was an Oliver transmission sitting anywhere that hadn't been reined into for 20 years, and the answer was no. He called a place that claimed online to stock vintage parts, and the man on the other end laughed, not cruelly, just in a way that said he'd heard that question 1,000 times from people who didn't want to accept how time works, and Hank ended the call with "yep, figured." As if he'd already filed it away as confirmation. He set the phone down and looked at the fork again, turning it in his hands, and David watched his friend's face for the first hint of defeat but didn't see it. What he saw was evaluation, the same expression Hank had when he judged a calf's limp or a fence post's lean, a look that said the problem is real but it's not bigger than me yet. David couldn't help himself. "It's what the kid said," he murmured, half a confession. "Non serviceable." Hank's mouth tightened the smallest amount. "They got a word for everything," he said. "Makes it feel official." David picked up the estimate from the desk where he'd tossed it the night before and slid it across the workbench. $4,200. The number stared up like a threat pretending to be a recommendation. Hank glanced at it once and didn't touch it. "That's not a repair price," Hank said. "That's a replacement price." David said, "He told me to retire it." Hank gave a short breath through his nose. They always say it's soft, he replied, like they're saving you. David leaned his weight on the bench and looked at the open transmission, at the crack that ran like a quiet accusation through the mounting boss, and he felt the same insult again, sharper now that the machine was in pieces. It wasn't about being told no, it was about being told no by someone who hadn't earned the right to say it. David wasn't proud in a loud way, he wasn't out there bragging about fixing things, but he had a kind of internal ledger, the kind you build after decades of getting through winters and harvests and breakdowns without an audience, and in that ledger the Oliver 1800 wasn't a disposable tool, it was a witness to his life. That tractor had been there when he was a kid with small hands sitting on the fender while his father drove it home in October of 1971, $3,400 spent on a used machine from a neighbor who was done farming, and that purchase had felt like a promise at the time because a tractor meant your family was serious about staying. David remembered the way his father had kept one hand on the wheel and one hand resting easy, as if he was telling the machine, "You're with us now," and David remembered thinking, at 9 years old, that the Oliver looked too big to ever break. Then the years happened like they do. 2 combines came and went, 4 trucks cycled through, the land stayed, the people changed, and the Oliver kept showing up in the background of everything, not as the main character but as the one that never left. It wasn't the tractor that made the most money. By 2019 David's real workhorse was a 2011 Case IH Maxim 125, newer, stronger, more comfortable, and if you were only doing logic, that's the tractor you'd protect at all costs. But logic isn't what gets a farm through a bad week. The Oliver did the jobs that didn't justify firing up the big machine, the jobs that came with awkward angles and tight corners and muddy approaches, the jobs that showed up at the end of a long day when your patience was already thin. It moved hay bales near the creek bottom. It pulled the old grain wagon across the barn lot. It ran the PTO on a vintage hay tedder that David had kept alive like a stubborn pet. And beyond the jobs, it held something else, familiarity. David could shift that tractor without thinking. He knew the sound it made when it was happy and the sound it made when it was asking for help. He knew the exact way third gear should feel when it took hold, the little resistance, the clean engagement, the absence of chatter, and that's why the grinding had bothered him early. It wasn't that it was loud, it was that it was wrong. When the kid with the laptop listened for 40 seconds and decided he'd heard enough, David had felt a flash of something like betrayal, not of the kid, but of the world that produced him. Because David had fixed plenty of things in his life that he had no business fixing, and not because he was special, but because farming taught him that waiting for the perfect part or the perfect permission is a good way to lose. He'd replaced the Oliver's clutch twice. He'd rebuilt the carburetor 3 times. In 1998 he'd needed a hydraulic line fitting that wasn't available and the tractor had to be in the ground by Thursday, so he'd made one out of a piece of copper tubing and a pair of pliers, swore at it until it sealed, and used it until the proper part finally surfaced months later. That wasn't a story he told for admiration, it was simply the way he'd lived, and he knew Hank lived the same way, maybe even more so. Hank's mechanical knowledge hadn't come from manuals. Hank learned it the way kids used to learn things when there wasn't time to romanticize learning. Standing next to his father, handing tools, watching hands, hearing corrections that were more grunts than sentences. Hank's father learned it from his father, and according to Hank, his grandfather had kept a 1938 John Deere be running for 11 years on improvisation, stubbornness, and what he called knowing the machine, which is a phrase that sounds vague until you're the one listening for the difference between a harmless rattle and a fatal one. David didn't need the whole family legend to believe the point. He believed it because he was staring at the cracked fork, and the fork wasn't a mystery, it was metal, and metal didn't care whether a part number existed. Hank set the shift fork down carefully, like he was laying a card on a table, then he reached into his tool roll and pulled out a small set of calipers and a marker. "We're not buying one," Hank said, not angry, just factual. "We're either saving this one or we're finding one in a donor somewhere, and I just called everybody I trust. There's no donor." David swallowed. "So what's left?" Hank didn't answer immediately. He looked at the crack again, traced it with his fingernail, and pressed both sides with his thumbs as if he were testing whether the fracture wanted to open up or stay shy. The crack ran diagonally across the mounting boss, and that detail mattered. A clean break is loud and final, but this wasn't clean, this was fatigue, a slow failure that had been growing in silence. "It's not separated," Hank said, almost to himself. "It's flexing." David asked, "Can it be welded?" Hank's eyes flicked up. "You weld there, and you change the metal. You'll make it hard where it needs to flex and soft where it needs to hold. And if you're wrong, you won't get a second try." David nodded because he knew that was true. He'd seen bad welds ruin good steel by turning it brittle. Hank continued, "We don't need pretty. We need hold." David could feel his own brain trying to climb towards safety, trying to say just spend the money, just replace the tractor, just avoid the risk, but that voice sounded like the dealership voice now, the voice that wanted to sell him a clean exit from a messy problem. Hank turned toward the synchronizer ring and ran a finger along the edge. "This ring's worn, but it's not dead," he said. "It's got life." David watched the ring spin in Hank's hands and thought about the word dead, because that was what the laptop had called the tractor in a roundabout way. Discontinued. No replacement. Non serviceable. Dead by paperwork. And yet here it was, still capable of being understood, still capable of being worked on by someone who wasn't afraid of a solution that didn't come from a screen. Hank picked up his phone again and made 3 more calls, not because he expected a miracle, but because a man like Hank doesn't stop at one layer of no. He called a retired mechanic he trusted who still had a shop behind his house and answered only if he recognized the number, and Hank got him on the line and asked the same question again. The retired mechanic was quiet for a moment, then said, "Haven't seen an 1800 fork in 10 years, and Hank said, "Figured," and hung up. He called one more salvage yard farther south, got a kid on the phone who kept repeating, "We got a website," and Hank cut him off with, "I don't need your website, I need your yard," but the answer was still no. He put the phone down for good, and David noticed that Hank didn't look frustrated. He looked settled, like the last polite option had closed, and that was, in a strange way, a relief. Hank said, "All right," and David asked, "All right what?" Hank reached into the tool roll and pulled out a bottle of acetone. "All right, we fix what we've got," Hank replied. David's throat tightened. "That's safe?" he asked, and he hated that he asked it because it sounded like he was asking permission to be brave. Hank gave him a look that wasn't harsh, just direct. "Nothing on a farm is safe," Hank said. "It's either controlled or it's chaos. We're going to control it." David nodded once. Hank poured a little acetone onto a rag and cleaned the area around the crack, thorough, methodical, like he was prepping a wound. "You see how it sits?" Hank asked. "The faces are still kissing." "That's good." David leaned closer. The crack was visible, but it wasn't gaping. It was a line that could be bullied back into obedience if you knew how. Hank pointed at the vise bolted to David's bench. "Open it," he said. David opened the jaws. Hank positioned the fork so the vise would apply pressure across the crack in the direction that would close it, not worsen it, and he tightened until the line thinned. "Not too much," Hank said. "You crush it, you lose alignment." David watched Hank's hands. That was the thing about Hank, he didn't move fast to show off, he moved at the speed of correctness. Hank tightened, paused, checked the angle, tightened again, then stopped the moment it was near invisible. "Now," Hank said, "we need to keep it from flexing." David said, "With what?" Hank's eyes flicked to the barn door, to the spool of steel wire David kept by the entrance for fence repairs. Hank nodded at it. "That," he said. David stared. "Wire." Hank's expression said yes, and also you'd better not start acting like wire is beneath you because wire has saved more farms than any dealership ever did. David walked over, grabbed the spool, and brought it back. Hank looked at the gauge by feel, then by sight and said, 14 will do. David didn't ask how he knew. Hank's confidence in the number was the kind that comes from having broken enough things to respect the right thickness. Hank cut a length, measured it against the boss, and then began wrapping it around in a pattern that wasn't random and wasn't pretty. 3 wraps, Hank said, mostly to himself, and offset. David watched as each wrap sat slightly different, not stacked, because Hank wanted tension distributed, not concentrated. Hank pulled it tight with pliers, twisted in opposing directions, and the wire tightened like a belt being cinched. "This is field binding," Hank said, and he said it like he wasn't naming a trick, he was naming a tool. David repeated it quietly, like he was trying the word on. "Field binding." Hank nodded. "My old man called it that," he said. "Temporary fix meant to get you to the shop." David glanced at the open transmission, at the bench, at the absence of any shop that could help them now. "We're not going to a shop," David said. Hank didn't flinch. "I know," he replied. "That's why we're doing it right." David felt a strange heat behind his eyes, not emotion like crying, more like pressure, the recognition that he was standing inside a kind of knowledge that people were losing without noticing. Hank tightened the twists again, then he reached for a small propane torch, the kind you could buy at any hardware store, and flicked it on. The flame hissed. Hank held it near the wire, moving it evenly. "Not glowing," he said. "Just close." David could smell hot metal. Hank watched the color, not with drama, but with the calm attention of someone reading a language. When the wire approached that point just below cherry red, Hank pulled the flame away and waited. "Let it cool," he said. "Metal shrinks when it cools. That's the point." As the wire cooled, Hank tightened the twist again, exploiting contraction like it was a lever. He killed the torch and tapped the boss lightly with a fingertip, listening to the sound it made, then tapped again. "That'll hold," Hank said. David wanted to ask, "You sure?" But he already knew Hank's answer, because Hank's kind of sure isn't a guarantee, it's a commitment. Instead David said, "What about the ring?" Hank picked up the synchronizer ring and set it on a hardwood block. He ran his thumb around the circumference and found a slight warp, small enough the kid with the laptop might never have noticed because it wasn't in the database, it was in the feel.
"It needs to seat," Hank said. "It's not seating clean."
David asked, "Can it be replaced?" Hank looked at him like he'd forgotten the last hour. "No," he said, and then his eyes softened just enough to remind David that the question wasn't stupid, it was human. Hank positioned the ring carefully and reached for a 16-ounce ball-peen hammer, old worn, the kind of hammer that fits the hand because it's been in it for decades. He held it for a second, not reverent, just ready. David watched his friend line up the first tap. It wasn't a swing. It was a controlled, exact movement, the kind you don't learn from a video because a video can't put the weight into your wrist. Hank tapped around the ring in a steady rhythm, not hard, not soft, just enough to persuade the metal into true.
Top, rotate, top, rotate.
David found himself holding his breath, not because it looked dangerous, but because it looked like a skill that could vanish in the space of one generation if no one cared to learn it. Hank stopped and checked the seating again. He adjusted the ring with his fingers, tested it, then tapped twice more and stopped for good. He looked up at David. "Now," Hank said, "we put it back together." David exhaled like he'd been underwater. He wasn't thinking about the $4,200 anymore. He was thinking about the gap between what a system calls impossible and what a person can do when they refuse to accept that word as final. Hank began laying parts out in order, and David stepped closer, ready to lift and hold and hand tools, and that's when Hank glanced at the vise one more time, gave the bound fork a final inspection, and said, quiet but decisive, "Hand me that hammer." They worked without talking for a while after that, not because there was nothing to say but because talking would have made it feel fragile, and neither of them wanted to name what they were doing too loudly in case the metal decided to disagree. Hank rechecked the alignment on the shift fork, loosened the vise slowly, watched the crack as pressure released, and when the line didn't open back up, when it held tight under its own tension and the wire sat firm against the boss like it had always belonged there, he gave a single nod that meant more than a paragraph of reassurance ever could. "Again," he said quietly, and David handed him the hammer, not because they needed to hit the fork but because Hank liked to listen to parts after they'd been persuaded. He tapped the mounting boss lightly, once, twice, 3 times, the sound sharp and clean, not dull, not rattling, and he tilted his head the same way he had when he'd listened to third gear under load earlier that morning.
"Still true," Hank muttered.
David didn't know exactly what true meant in mechanical terms, but he knew what it meant in Hank's language. The structure underneath the damage hadn't been lost. That was the difference between repair and replacement. Replacement assumes structure is gone. Repair assumes structure is waiting to be respected. They reassembled the transmission methodically, reversing the morning's work in steady steps, gears back into place, shafts aligned, the synchronizer ring seated carefully on its cone, the repaired fork positioned with deliberate attention, and David found himself moving more cautiously than usual, not out of fear but out of awareness that this wasn't a job you rushed. You rush when you're swapping parts from a box. You don't rush when you're asking metal to forgive you. The barn clock ticked past 3 in the afternoon by the time the casing was sealed again, and Hank wiped his hands, stood straight, and stretched his back with a grimace that reminded David neither of them were young enough to do this without paying for it later. "Let's see if she'll go back in," Hank said, and there was no ceremony to it, just the practical step of lifting the transmission with the jack, guiding it into position, aligning bolts, tightening everything down in a pattern that Hank insisted on even when no one was watching. David tightened the last bolt and stepped back, breathing harder than he wanted to admit. Hank poured fresh 80W90 gear oil into the housing, slow and steady, the smell thick and familiar, and when he set the container aside he looked at David in a way that was almost casual.
"All right," he said. "Start it."
David climbed into the seat and paused for a second before turning the key.
He didn't pray.
He didn't make promises. He just listened to his own breathing and thought about how small the gap is between confidence and humiliation. If third gear ground now, if it slipped worse than before, there would be no arguing with the verdict. The system would have been right. David turned the key. The engine caught, rough for a moment, then steady. Hank stood off to the side, arms crossed, eyes not on David but on the transmission housing like he could see through it. David let the engine warm a bit, foot on the clutch, and he went through first, then second, smooth enough, nothing unusual. Then he hesitated, hovering at the edge of third like it was a line he might not want to cross.
Hank didn't say a word. David eased it into third.
There was a faint resistance, the normal kind, and then engagement.
Clean. No grinding. No chatter. No sleep.
He held it there, waiting for the sound he'd been dreading, but it didn't come. He eased out the clutch slowly and the Oliver rolled forward, Steady, controlled. Hank raised one eyebrow but didn't smile.
Down the lane, he said.
David drove it out of the barn, down toward the creek bottom where he'd first noticed the problem weeks earlier, the same stretch of ground that had made the slipping obvious under load. He turned at the edge of the field and brought it back, shifting down and then up again into third deliberately, testing it not once but 3 times, because hope is easy the first time and fragile the second.
Each shift was the same. Clean. True. Engaged.
When he pulled back into the barn he cut the engine and sat there longer than he meant to, hands still on the wheel, looking straight ahead. Hank climbed up onto the step and leaned in just enough to be heard.
You gonna say it? He asked.
David shook his head slightly. Not yet, he replied, because he didn't want to declare victory over something that could still decide to embarrass him next week.
Hank stepped back down. Fair enough, he said. They didn't celebrate.
There wasn't any backslapping or grand speeches about proving anyone wrong. They cleaned up the tools, wiped down the bench, and set the old parts aside like they might need to tell the story later with something physical in their hands. David folded the yellow carbon copy estimate and slid it into a drawer instead of throwing it away. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. The kid with the laptop hadn't been malicious. He'd done exactly what he was trained to do: identify a part, search the approved channels, conclude based on availability. In his world, that was responsible. In David's world, responsibility included knowing when a word like non-serviceable was a reflection of supply chains, not of reality. That evening David sat at his kitchen table and replayed the day in his head, not the technical steps but the moments in between. The way Hank had listened before touching anything, the way he'd refused to let the first no be the final no, the way he'd tightened the wire after it cooled as if he were finishing a sentence he'd started decades earlier.
David wasn't naive.
He knew the repair wasn't factory spec. He knew if you put it in a manual, a certified transmission engineer would circle it in red and write liability across the margin. But farms don't run on liability margins. They run on whether something works when you need it to. Over the next week he used the Oliver cautiously at first, half expecting third gear to betray him under a heavy pull, but it didn't. The engagement stayed clean. The sound stayed right. By the second week he stopped flinching when he shifted. By the third, he caught himself forgetting there had ever been a problem, and that was when he understood what the repair had actually done. It hadn't just fixed a fork. It had preserved a choice. The choice not to let a database decide what stayed alive on his land. Hank came by 3 mornings that week like he always did, not to inspect the work, not to ask if it held, just to drink coffee and lean against the barn door like a man who knew better than to hover. On the 4th morning David handed him a folded piece of paper. Hank unfolded it and saw the $4,200 estimate staring back.
You keeping score? Hank asked.
David shrugged. Just remembering, he said. Hank nodded once and handed it back. Remember this too, he said, tapping the transmission housing with a knuckle. It held because it could. Not because we wanted it to. That line stuck with David longer than anything else Hank had said that day. It held because it could. Meaning the structure was there, the integrity was there, and the only thing missing had been someone willing to work inside the limits instead of declaring the limits final. As the weeks turned into months and the 2019 season rolled forward, the Oliver kept doing its specific jobs: hay bales in tight spaces, grain wagon through the lot, PTO humming on the tedder, and each time David slid into third he felt a small, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with money. It was about continuity. About refusing to let a chain break simply because it wasn't convenient to maintain. He didn't tell many people about the repair. It wasn't a story he broadcast. But every now and then, when someone at the feed store complained about how they don't make 'em like they used to, David would think about the kid with the laptop and about Hank's hammer and about the wire cooling just below cherry red, and he would realize the issue wasn't how they make them now. It was how willing people are to understand them. And somewhere between that thought and the steady hum of third gear under load, David began to understand that the real cost in that $4,200 quote had never been the money. It had been the assumption that knowledge ends where the parts list does. By the time summer settled in for good, the repair had moved from experiment to routine, and that shift happened so quietly David almost missed it. There was no dramatic moment where he declared the Oliver saved, no day where he stood in the yard and felt triumphant, just a slow accumulation of ordinary uses that did not fail. That was the part the dealership would never understand. Failure is loud. Survival is quiet. The Oliver moved hay bales in June when the creek bottom was soft and the ground demanded precision more than power. It backed into tight corners where the larger case IH would have felt clumsy. It pulled the old grain wagon in July heat without a complaint, and each time David reached for third gear he did it with a memory of that crack in his head, not as fear but as awareness. The engagement stayed clean.
No grinding. No sleeping.
Just the solid, mechanical certainty he had known for decades. And with each clean shift, something else settled in him too, a realization that what they had done in the barn was more than a workaround. It was a refusal. Not loud. Not defiant in the way people imagine rebellion. Just a quiet refusal to let a process declare something dead because it could not be conveniently sourced. Hank never asked, still holding. He didn't need to. He would show up 3 or 4 mornings a week, thermos under his arm, stand near the barn door, and if the Oliver was parked in its usual spot with a light coat of dust and no fresh oil on the floor beneath it, that was answer enough. Sometimes David would start it while Hank was there, let it idle, then slip it into third just so Hank could hear it for himself. Hank would tilt his head, the same way he had the first day, and give that almost imperceptible nod that meant the metal was still true. They didn't turn it into a ritual, but it became one anyway. There's a difference between doing something to prove a point and doing something because it needs doing. The dealership's verdict had felt like a point. Hank's repair felt like necessity. Late that August, during a stretch of heavy work, David pushed the Oliver harder than he had since the fix. A sudden rain had forced him to move bales quickly, and he didn't have time to baby the clutch. He loaded the tractor heavier than usual and took the incline near the creek at a sharper angle. For a split second as he eased into third under load, he felt the ghost of that old hesitation, the memory of slipping from weeks before. His jaw tightened. If it failed now, it would fail honestly, not in a quiet test drive but under real strain. He listened, foot steady, engine humming. Third engaged. Held. Pulled. The tractor climbed without protest. David exhaled slowly and realized he'd been bracing for disappointment not because he doubted Hank, but because he understood risk. That was the difference between him and the kid with the laptop. The kid had no risk in his diagnosis. If the tractor was replaced, the dealership won. If it was retired, the system was justified. But if David and Hank were wrong, there would be no warranty, no fallback. Just a heavier repair and the knowledge that they had chosen the harder path and lost. That's what made the clean pull up that incline matter. It wasn't luck. It was validation earned under load. Over the next few seasons, 2019 rolled into 2020, then 2021, and then 2022, and the Oliver never gave third gear trouble again. The transmission was never opened. The wire stayed where it had been bound, unseen inside the housing, doing its quiet job. Time, which the dealership had used as an argument against repair, became the proof in its favor. 5 seasons. 5 years of work. 5 years where the $4,200 stayed in David's bank account and not on a parts invoice. He didn't spend it on anything dramatic. He put some into seed, some into maintenance on the Case IH, some into things that needed fixing around the house. The money wasn't the victory. The control was. In the fall of 2022, Hank's visits grew less frequent. Not because he wanted them to, but because his body was negotiating with him in ways it hadn't before. Kidney failure came fast. That's the phrase people use when they don't want to describe the details. One week Hank was leaning against the barn door listening to an engine idle. The next week he was in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and time running short. David visited twice before Hank told him not to make a habit of it. "You got work," Hank said. "Don't start hovering over me like I hover over tractors." David tried to smile at that. It didn't stick. Hank passed in the fall, and the funeral filled faster than David expected. He arrived late, not on purpose, but because chores don't stop when grief begins. He sat in the back because the front rows were full, and while someone at the front talked about Hank's reliability and quiet competence, David found himself thinking about that afternoon in the barn. About acetone and wire and heat just below cherry red. About the sound of a hammer used not to force but to coax. He realized then that what the dealership's database couldn't list wasn't just a part. It couldn't list the way Hank listened. It couldn't quantify the pause before a decision. It couldn't record the weight of a hammer that had belonged to a man's father and still fit the son's hand because it had been repaired instead of replaced. After the service, people gathered in small circles outside, trading stories the way people do when someone steady has left a space behind. David didn't speak much. He nodded when someone mentioned Hank's knack for keeping old equipment alive. He didn't tell the whole story about the Oliver. He didn't need to. The proof was still sitting in his barn. In the spring of 2023, David drove the Oliver out for the first real job of the season. The air was sharp in the morning, and he let the engine warm before moving. He slid into third without hesitation. Clean engagement. The same as that first afternoon after the repair. For a brief moment, he considered what would have happened if he'd accepted the word non-serviceable without question. The Oliver would have been sold for scrap or parked behind the barn to rust into irrelevance. The $4,200 would have been spent not on saving something, but on replacing it. And the knowledge that Hank carried, field binding, controlled heat, listening to metal, would have remained unused, unpassed on in that moment. That was the part that stayed with David the longest. Not the money. Not the satisfaction. The realization that every time someone accepts a system's final answer without asking whether the system sees the whole picture, something small disappears. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just link by link. David didn't think of himself as preserving a tradition. He would have laughed at that description. To him, he fixed a tractor because it needed fixing and he knew someone who knew how. But when he shut down the Oliver that afternoon and stepped off the platform, he rested his hand briefly on the fender the way he had when he was 9 years old riding it home with his father. The metal was warm under his palm. Solid. Real. It didn't know it had been declared dead. It didn't know about supplier databases or discontinued listings. It only knew that when third gear was asked to engage, it did. And in that simple response was a quiet answer to a question the kid with the laptop hadn't even realized he was asking. 5 years after the kid stood on David's gravel lane with a laptop open on the tailgate and a verdict printed in yellow carbon, the Oliver 1800 is still working the same ground it has worked since 1971. It still slips into third the way it should.
No grind. No hesitation.
Just engagement. The transmission has not been opened again. The wire Hank wrapped around that cracked shift fork is still inside the housing, unseen, uncelebrated, doing exactly what it was asked to do. The $4,200 that was supposed to mark the end of that tractor never left David's account in one dramatic act of defiance. It simply stayed where it was, absorbed back into the quiet math of running a farm. Seed. Fuel. Repairs that actually needed parts. Life. When people talk about stories like this, they want a villain. They want the dealership to be greedy or the kid to be arrogant. But that isn't what happened. The kid did what he was trained to do. He followed the system. He searched the approved paths. He saw discontinued listings and concluded what the process told him to conclude. In his world, that was competence. In David's world, competence included knowing when a process had reached its limit. That's the tension that never makes it onto the invoice. It wasn't man versus machine. It was experience versus a closed loop. It was listening versus looking something up. Hank never framed it that way. He never talked about systems or decline or lost knowledge. He fixed what was in front of him because it could be fixed. That's all. And then, in the fall of 2022, he was gone. Kidney failure. Quick. The kind of ending that doesn't give you time to organize your thoughts. David drove to the funeral in the same truck he'd had for 11 years and sat in the back because he arrived late, and while someone at the front talked about Hank's reliability, David found himself thinking about a hammer tapping a synchronizer ring into true. Not swinging. Not forcing. Coaxing. That was the word Hank used without making a big deal of it. Coaxing metal back into alignment. Coaxing a machine back into service. Coaxing a decision away from surrender. The dealership database never learned that word. It doesn't know how to measure it. It can't list it as available or discontinued. It only knows whether a part number exists. The Oliver never cared about any of that. In the creek bottom on a Tuesday morning in May, with third gear humming clean under load, it simply did what it had always done. It worked. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not the money saved. Not even the repair itself. But the reminder that non-serviceable sometimes means only that the system doesn't recognize the path forward. It doesn't mean there isn't one.